Gettysburg Museum of History Studios. You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
All right, before we get started, real quickly, I wanted to mention our moderator today, Brian Luskey. His book, Men is Cheap, which we have for sale at the bookstore. I wanted to mention this book because Brian's work actually intersected with some of the conversations we had yesterday on the panel of Lincoln and Race. And at the very end, Scott Hancock read an excerpt, and it was at the very core the blinders that particularly abolitionists and Northerners had when it came to some of the key issues of free labor ideology. And many of the contradictions of free labor ideology were being actually revealed to Northerners as well as Southerners, but to Northerners during the war. And this book, Brian's book, it addresses many of those topics. It's an underexplored issue until Brian's scholarship. So I wanted to mention Brian, who's right behind me here. Again, Brian's being our moderator today. I'll let him take over. But Men is Cheap. It's for sale back at the bookstore. All right.
Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to moderate this panel, which is titled, Did Civil War Soldiers Hide the Real War? It sounds like quite maybe an expose. You can imagine a 21st century journalist getting a hold of this story. Lying Civil War soldiers and the lying women who loved them on the next crossfire. I don't know if we'll get to that, but certainly we're going to learn a lot about what soldiers did tell us about their war experience, what we can learn from the sources that are available to us, and what's maybe still hidden in the archives and what these historians have been working on and what they've been learning. There's always something new to learn about the real war. Our panelists, starting with Dr. Clarke, closest to me, Frances Clarke, is Associate Professor of History at the University of Sydney in Australia. She is the author of War Stories, Suffering and Sacrifice in the Civil War North, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2011. Next to Dr. Clarke is Rebecca Jo Plant. She's a professor of history at the University of California at San Diego. She is the author of Mom, The Transformation of Motherhood in Modern America, which was also published by the University of Chicago in 2010. Together, Dr. Plant and Dr. Clarke have written a book published by Oxford in 2023 called Of Age, Boy Soldiers and Military Power in the Civil War Era. And that book has been awarded the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History's Lincoln Prize. Jim Broomall, farthest from me, is Associate Professor of History at Shepherd University in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. He's the director of the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. He's a cultural historian of the Civil War era. He is the author of the book published by UNC Press called Private Confederacies, The Emotional Worlds of Southern Men as Citizens and Soldiers, and also the co-editor of a book with Bill Link called Rethinking American Emancipation, Legacies of Slavery and the Quest for Black Freedom, published by Cambridge in 2016. This question, which is the title for our talk, is not about a conspiracy theory about what soldiers have been long hiding from us, but something that has, I think, always puzzled, confronted, provoked historians to understand, and it comes from the war era. I suppose there may be many origin stories of that there was a real war and it can't quite be accessed, I guess, afterward. But the starting point that I introduced to my own students in a Civil War course is this passage from I'm not going to need these glasses to see this. I'm going to look from up here and read it to you. I promise this is the only slide with a big block of text. But Walt Whitman published, the poet Walt Whitman published this prose book called Specimen Days in the early 1880s that talked about and used long passages from his diary about his working as a nurse in Fredericksburg and Washington and taking care of grievously wounded soldiers and watching a lot of them pass away and then writing letters to their family members on their behalf to explain how they died. And so this quotation to me is still somewhat puzzling after recounting what I would have called some of the real war. At least as it was taking place in hospitals. So Whitman says, future years will never know, sorry about that, the seething hell and black infernal background of countless minor scenes and interiors of the Secession War. And it is best they should not. The real war will never get in the books. Its interior history will not only never be written, its practicality, minutiae of deeds and passions will never be even suggested. The actual soldier, North and South, with all his ways, his incredible dauntlessness, habits, practices, taste, language, his fierce friendship, his appetite, rankness, his superb strength and animality, lawless gait, and 100 unnamed lights and shades of camp, I say, will never be written, perhaps must not and should not be. So with that, the first question I think I'd like to start with the panelists, and we can maybe seamlessly merge from answers to this first question to later ones on this list, is to start with, well, what do you think Walt meant? And maybe then get into the second one is, what about soldiers' interior histories and how have we gone about trying to understand them? Would anybody like to start?
Sure, I'll start. You can all hear me okay? Yeah? When I look at this, I actually think the bit before this quote is really significant, like you've cut out a bit, but basically he says what he means. He says, the latent personal character embodied in these armies, especially the people who were stricken by wounds and disease, were of more significance than the political interests involved in the war. So the real war for Whitman, I think it's an emotional, sentimental war. And I mean, people have used this quote for generations to mean one thing, which is, I think, the Victorians are very sentimental. The way that they talk about war is in that kind of heroic, sentimental, romantic vein. They're not talking about the real war, which is the blood and guts, the terror, the slaughter, the battlefield, right? I don't think that's what he means at all. I think he means, he's been watching people die over and over again. And we've got to say, this is very charged with homoerotic energy, this passage, I think. Whitman is a man who is intimate with other men. He loves other men. And when he says it does not, and cannot get into the books, I think maybe there's suggestions that certain things should not be said, that the men's relationship with each other in an all-male space maybe isn't appropriate to talk about in other settings, So I think that's going on. But I also think we misread this quote from our own perspective, without thinking that the real war for Whitman is actually that sort of emotional intensity. And you can't talk to people about it because there's just so much of it. You can't possibly express the hundreds of thousands of little intimate moments in the war. I think that's what he's saying.
Well, we discussed this last night. Basically, I share that belief. And I also am very struck with the emphasis, he uses this term race in the old-fashioned sense of a people. And he's really very concerned about, how people suffer. He's very concerned about the ways in which the soldiers, the true war is what you see when someone is cheerful in the midst of immense suffering, or how they help a comrade even when they themselves are in great distress. That seems to me to be, he's saying that the people who are fighting this war, it's the mettle that they show under these very trying circumstances that is the real war.
Should we start pivoting to two, Brian? Or
We can.
yeah, I think because I agree entirely with what's been said. I think this bigger question that's being raised though is these interior histories, and for me, is really a secondary source that alerted me to the importance of this type of work, this emotional history, where we're trying to interrogate how people experienced and how they in turn translated that experience into expression of war. And that was Steve Berry's All That Makes a Man. And Steve's been a frequent scholar here at CWI. And he really positioned soldiers in such a way that they were trying to relate their wartime experiences to the women that they loved, and how in turn they were being transformed over the course of that experience, of the wartime experience, and how they're trying to translate that experience into these letters. And that's tough stuff to get at, because our emotional worlds are vastly different than those of 19th century Americans. And then we have to think about the modes of narrative construction that they're trying to create. And then the soldiers themselves are having scenes that are incomprehensible, as our first speaker just noted with the 1913 reunions. They're coming back to these battlefields, looking at landscapes that were almost incomprehensible to them as young men. They're trying to create a sort of a narrative understanding of what happened. And I think that they are quite willing to disclose these interior histories and these interior experiences, most certainly through spoken word to their comrades. But what to me has been so remarkable in the letter collections that I've read is that they're straining to do so with their loved ones in almost the most horrific of ways. I remember a young man coming out of Chancellorsville writing to his mother saying that because of the frenetic nature of the battle and because of the sparks, the woods were set ablaze, and he then witnessed wounded men being consumed by fire. And there was something, I think, at that moment that changed within him. And while with the typical sensibilities of the Victorian American, they wouldn't want to disclose that experience, he had been so struck or traumatized by it that he had to put it into his letter to his mother, showing her, suggesting to her perhaps that when he will come home eventually, if he ever does, he may very well not be the same person that came there before. And citizens themselves start to sense that when men do return on furloughs or at the very end of the war, that they have physically changed, but more importantly, they've emotionally altered as well. And that's given rise, I think, to this idea that there is an unwillingness to disclose those experiences because they're so horrific, to suppress those interior histories, to suppress elements of the quote-unquote real war, because how can you resurrect those memories and how can you communicate those memories is so extraordinarily difficult.
Could we talk a little bit about the modes of communication that soldiers use to express their experience? Why write letters? Why keep a diary? What other types of source material mediated the soldiers' writings in such a way to shape them according to cultural scripts? I'm struck with Jim mentioning this North Carolinian talking about in gruesome detail, frankly, Jim talks about this in Private Confederacies, of bodies burning and how awful it was to see. In Rebecca and Francis's book, Of Age, they note that literature for children very often talked in gory detail about war, and that's quite surprising. And then there's, of course, the flip side of this is what Jim said is words cannot express. This is a genre of letters where soldiers are saying, I can't explain, I don't have the words to explain this. And so could you talk about just the kind of the source material we're working with and what it tells us about
how this maybe disjointedness between experience and then cultural expression.
Well, what is experience? I mean, we're shaping what the experience is as we're narrating it. So I think through the narration, like as you're in a moment, things are happening to you, but what does that actually mean to you? How does that affect you? We don't really know until we start to talk about it and weave it out into a story and, and incorporate it into our lives. And you might tell different stories about that into different kinds of audiences. That's what human beings do, right? In front of that audience, I'll emphasise this part of that stuff that happened to me. We're not lying when we do that, but we're shaping, the story. But experiences, things don't happen to us and they're just there as an experience, as a single thing. Our experience changes over time. We remember things over time, I think. Do you want to?
Yeah, and maybe it helps to just share the experience of looking at certain kinds of sources that we've come across. There's one case where we had, this is a Confederate, we have a boy writing to his father, and he's like 18, I believe, and writing to his mother. So we can actually see that different audience. And it is incredibly different, as you say. When they're writing to women, they're doing something else. And so, the letter to the mother is like 1,000 other Civil War letters that we've read where he's assuring her, the boys are in good spirits and talking about camp life. Then you get the letter to the father, and what he's frantic about is that they do not let the younger boy, the younger brother, who is not yet 18 and so not yet subject to conscription, he wants to volunteer. And he is adamant that this is a terrible idea. And you get a real sense of what he's suppressing in the letter to the mother, because he's basically saying the men are hardened, it's going to corrupt him, physically he won't be able to take it, this is just a horrible situation. And he writes multiple letters after that, like begging, keep him home. And of course he enlists. But so we do have, and just in terms of your question about sources, I guess I would say that some of the sources that we found really revelatory, there's a difference between the memoirs, where you really get the sense of people shaping their story, and the letters. But the letters, as you all probably well know, many of these letters are written actually to be published in newspapers. People know they're going to be circulated, they're going to be read aloud. They're public documents in a sense. So you can't think of them as, the difference between, say, a public-facing memoir and private letters. It's not that neat. It's not that neat at all. But what you do sometimes find, and you find them in weird places, like pension records. We found in the case of a mother who is seeking a pension on the basis of her underage son's military service, we found she submits this series of letters, and they're very working class. It's sort of almost it's not, the literacy level is very low. But what you come across here is it's clear evidence that he's supporting the family with the money he's sending back, and he is, frantic to find out how they're doing. Did you get the $5 I sent? Did you get the blanket I sent? So he, this 50-year-old at war who's suffering all kinds of things himself, is like trying to take care of the family back home. And that, we would never have a source like that, except unless, those are the kind of letters that would never have ended up in an archive, right? But she did save them, and then she submitted them years later, and they're in this pension file. And so, there are these places where, letters from working class people whose voices are far less represented do show up.
I'll follow that thread. And for those of you who've been frequent CWI visitors, the name John Futch will resonate because Pete, of course, has spent a great deal of time working on Futch and, John and Charlie Futch. And in this remarkable letter collection, as he's often talked about and disclosed and talked about so well in his book, The War for the Common Soldier, there's a remarkable sequence of letters that relate to the death of Charlie at Culp's Hill, probably on the evening of July 2nd. He may have succumbed on the morning of July 3rd. But in those letters, we get a glimpse of different socioeconomic levels and how they are interpreting the experience of death. And so there's one letter about Charlie's death written by someone who's well-versed in 19th century etiquette. They probably were familiar with writing manuals, which literally taught you how to write a letter. And it's framed in ways that would resonate, right? He has ultimately gone to a better place. This was providential. I'm willing to sacrifice him to the cause, to the nation, to his God. And it's a rhetoric that's over the top. But in the 6 letters about Charlie's death, 2 are written by what we might call a transitionally literate soldier, a soldier who probably spoke his letters to a comrade. And in those letters, the death is framed entirely differently. And John reveals, John Futch, that the death of his brother has made him, quote, almost crazy. It totally overthrows what you would seemingly expect from a 19th century letter. And because of the work of Steve Berry and his team down at the University of Georgia, we have this Private Voices repository, which just offers you all such an incredible opportunity to search through letters from a socioeconomic group that we don't often hear about. And what they often say in those letters runs counter to what you would expect from a middle or upper class writer. And so it again suggests that not only does audience matter, but as Rebecca has started to say, class is going to matter too. And so the experiences of death and of war and of combat look very differently depending upon the hand that wrote them and the socioeconomic background of the individual who's the author, or at least the speaker of the letter.
Can I just add a couple of things here? One is a little personal anecdote, just to say that after I finished my first book, which dealt with a lot of Civil War letters, my grandmother died and I got back all the letters I'd written to her during grad school. So, it was really interesting because I was reading me and how I expressed myself to a particular audience, my grandparents. There was nothing of the most important things that had happened to me in grad school in those letters, and that really made me rethink the stuff that I had done for my first book. And I think one of the things that I wasn't as conscious of as I should have been as an early historian, it's not just that audience matters, it's that audience completely shapes everything. So the other day I was in the archives and we're looking at court-martial records at the moment, and one soldier was court-martialed for writing a letter to another soldier in which he's basically talking about his sexual life. And, I'm going blind because I've been, I won't use the terms that he used, but, you can imagine he's been masturbating too much. And so he's saying that to his friend. And, what we mostly have in the archives is men writing to their families. What we have very small amount of is men writing to other men. And when you read those letters from men writing to other men, the tone is very, very different. So I think we need to be more careful. It's not just the audience, it's the, the gender, the class, of our audience, and that really just determines everything about what's in the letters. And when we think about like James McPherson's For Cause or Comrade, or, it was an early effort to think about, people's, common soldiers. But I think we need another study like that really does a sort of quantitative, qualitative, but is more attuned, I think, to the specificity of the letters, because he sort of just groups them all together.
Do you want to go back to war stories? Should we?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, because it's an important.
I'm still thinking about Brian's question. When do you get to a situation where the words can't express, and where do you find that in the archives?
I think one of the challenges that historians have had is that they oftentimes assemble a series of quotes from disparate letters, and then they themselves create a narrative tradition around that. And by so doing, they're doing the work of historians, of course, but you're losing a bit of the individual's arc, the narrative arc. And so in trying to retrieve or reclaim those personalities, again, Steve Barry, Pete Carmichael, these are historians who spent a lot of time dealing with a very specific set of individuals to try to understand the narrative arc of their experiences over time. And that results in a very different book. It's not for cause and comrades. But by so doing, and oftentimes when we spend a lot of time within an archival collection, which is where I'm the happiest, frankly, and you deal with a family or an individual for sometimes weeks on end, you really begin to, you can't fully understand them, but you can identify elements of their personality, and you can even get to sympathize with some of their plights. And I think that soldiers truly did struggle over the course of their wartime experiences to find the best means and modes of communication, and they themselves were constantly changing and transforming. Many of the men that I looked at ultimately did die somewhere between 1863 and 1865, but there was a large number who survived and wrote stuff into 66 and 67. And they're pushed almost into the realm of confusion. How can you have a providential worldview when war seems so random, when the killings are so unpredictable? And many still do square it with a providential worldview, but there are those who begin to feel as though the time is truly fleeting, as our first speaker just said earlier today, and that this is extraordinarily precious. And while they're not pushed into the realm of atheism, they begin to question that this is preordained or predictable because it seems so random and it seems so uncertain. And they are willing to make those disclosures in letters because they themselves are changing so dramatically. How can they do otherwise? Because the etiquette that they knew in the 1840s and 1850s fails to comprehend the experiences that they're having in 1862 and 1863. But those moments are hard to reclaim in the archive. And again, you have to spend a lot of time with a collection that has a great deal of continuity, and a lot of the letters are left intact. I tend to study white Southerners. Those are some of the most problematic collections because many of the letters are simply missing. But when you can get those stories together, you, I think, get a sense of how they themselves are struggling to express what they are experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
Can I share?
Of course.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Hello.
You think that's a providential voice, yeah.
This has been my favorite panel experience thus far. It seems to be working okay. Would you take some time now and talk about your current projects and how that work is, oh boy.
It does. Our current work actually speaks to this question about the real war. We're doing a couple of projects right now. We've just finished one and we're sort of starting another. Before Rebecca and I began of age, I started looking at this collection of letters in the Adjutant General's office, which were letters that ordinary people had written into the federal government during the war. They're asking for various things, my son's in hospital, I think he should be resting at home. I haven't heard from my father for the last 2 years. They're really, this is hundreds of thousands of letters from ordinary people. And, when I saw that collection in the National Archives, I was gobsmacked because no one had used it. This is going back, 15 years. Or they might have used it to find one letter, but they'd never looked at it across to think, here's hundreds of thousands of people, writing to the federal government for the first time. So I was very interested because most of the letters revealed extreme hardship on the home front. These are experiences often of very poor people that you don't usually see in Civil War history because they don't write a lot. What are the sources that remain to us? The archives are replete with bias, with the biases that exist out there in the world. They mostly record the experiences of powerful people. So many, more obscure people just don't end up in the archives. So it's very hard to access what the war was like for them, what their real war was like. But this collection, is hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, women out on farms who've got 6 kids, and they're writing into the government. They're really angry. You've taken my husband. He hasn't been paid for 6 months. How am I supposed to live? So Rebecca and I did a sort of survey of these hardship letters, just trying to track, looking at the women and what was happening to them on the home front, and sort of thinking about hardship among women. And then the other project that we're doing at the moment, it's Rebecca, myself, and Judy Gettysburg, another Civil War historian who's written a lot about the history of sexuality during the Civil War. She's written a book on pornography, which is everywhere. There's a real war that didn't get a lot of press before Judy's book. But we're in the court-martial records looking at cases where men come up on charges for the charges of conduct unbecoming or prejudicial to good order, so depending on whether you're an officer or an ordinary soldier, and the charges are relating to some sort of transgression of sexual behaviour between men. So often older men sexually abusing boys, or officers who've had a misunderstanding. Maybe he put his hand on his knee and then, the other guy didn't like that. So we're doing these cases where people come up on charges based around sex. And I think that gives you a very different perspective on the war and on lying, actually, because the lies through the court-martial records, you can often tell when people are just lying about what they did. But do you want to say anything more about?
No, just that in both of those cases, the documents themselves are structured in a certain way. The letters in the Adjutant General's office are petitions. They're people who want something from the government, right? And so you have to keep that in mind the whole time you're reading them. Are they exaggerating their hardship? And this is where I have to say, just confessing my concerns as a historian, I don't know if you all are the same, but I think I feel like I can tell when people are authentic. I feel like I could tell, and I often worry that is wrong. That I put too much faith in my own ability to. It's like when people have a certain level of detail, and in history, the details are always weird, right? And if they're just weird and they seem very quirky and the way the person's relating it is pretty straightforward, I always feel like I trust those petitions. I trust those letters. But again, some of this is an act of faith, right? History is not a science. It is an art of interpretation. So there's that, and then the court-martial records, of course, are highly structured documents that both reveal and conceal. So, you have to look at okay, what is the source itself? What is the format of the source, and not just go to the content.
And it's sort of maddening because, you've got to quickly realise the court-martials are not interested in finding the truth. They're not looking for the truth of what really happened. What they're looking for is that charge true or not? That's it. It's a very blunt thing, and they're often very short. So you've got these, they're like little micro cases, and they can be very, very rich, but people aren't testifying a great deal, right? So a lot of sources are very truncated in that way, and thinking about what was the objective of the source, what are the creator of the source, what's their purpose, often frames the information that they're giving to you.
It's the slideshow, yeah. So I'll use the slideshow to illustrate what's happening. Okay.
Which lights?
The camp one, the not the Omen Hauser, but the first one, the Chapman. One more. Okay. So when I was working on my first project, I spent, again, a lot of time in the archives, but I also had always had an interest in visual and material culture. And I had, I think on the first draft, especially of my book, just be like full confession here, a pretty idealized vision of camp life in particular. I took a lot of the soldiers' letters maybe too much at their word, and I wasn't thinking critically enough about the sources or the experiences therein. And reader 2, it's always reader 2, this kind of a tough one. Reader 2 sort of stripped me out of my complacency and really suggested I needed to re-examine it. And I don't know if it's the reader's suggestion or a friend I had at the American Civil War Museum, but I'm going to juxtapose two images here, which will suggest sort of where I'm going with my next project. So in the first image, this is pretty well known. I think probably a number of you in the audience have seen it, Conrad Wise Chapman. He did a series of images of Charleston Harbor. They had this very famous image of the 59th Virginia Infantry Wise's Brigade, done just after the fact. And certainly elements of the materiality of this image align quite specifically with the descriptions that we get of the camp experience, right? The type of tendage that's used, this sort of informality that's experienced, this all-male environment. But we could go one more. If we look at another image of Wise's Brigade, this is the same body of men, yet this is a much more informal watercolor done by John Omenhauser, and many of you may know him from his wonderful watercolors of Point Lookout. It's the same group of individuals in the same environment. Now, what you're not going to be able to read from where you are is the critique that's being offered in the watercolor itself. One man says essentially that as I'm chopping this wood, my heart rate has gone to 240 beats per minute. I need a doctor. Another guy says that I'm so sick of this pork, there's no way I can eat in this army any longer. And it's this massive critique of army life and camp life. And then the biggest indictment, if you look at the tent, the officer class is gambling. And so it's this scathing view of camp life, and yet these are two entirely different views of the very same environment. And what this started to suggest to me is that if we get beyond the paper record and start moving to the visual or material record, perhaps we're going to see the view in a very different, we're going to see the war in a very different way. And one individual in particular who has an incredibly graphic portrayal of both Shiloh and Stones River, Adolph Metzner, did a series of watercolors that you would think, and I didn't ask Brian to show them because they are so graphic, they're off a World War I battlefield. Decapitated bodies, bodies split in two by the power of an artillery shell. It's extraordinarily jarring. It's extraordinarily harrowing. And if you want to understand what a battlefield looked like, go no farther than Adolph Metzner's watercolors. And yet we, oftentimes as scholars, have lost, and now Jimmy Brooks has done a fabulous article on those very images. But to me, that unearthed an entire tradition that I was entirely unaware of, because so much of 19th century art deals with the trope of naturalism, the romantic tradition, and yet there are soldiers who themselves were artists, Adolph Metzner, James Hope, who took that artistic sensibility of the 19th century and turned it on its head because of the experience of war. Sometimes they're able to blend the two genres in sort of jarring ways, as James Hope does in his pretty well-known After the Battle, which is currently not on display at Antietam National Park, but was for more than several decades, where the pastoral background is set off before the front, which of course is the mass of bodies in the sunken road. And so I think what I would urge you all to think about is go beyond the letters. They're fabulous. And again, I've spent the better part of my past 20 years in archives. But go to these museums and think about the objects and the images that are there. Think about the different modes of portrayal. Think about what artists or soldier artists are trying to represent, and how that in turn is establishing a very different, in some instances, narrative tradition. And this is just a quick example, but if you juxtapose these two images of Wise's Brigade, you get entirely different views of the very same place, of the very same body of men. And so you have to be open to those different types of evidence, or look in places that historians haven't looked previously.
There's endless untapped sources.
Yes.
Really endless.
Yeah, it's so, as a graduate student, you panic when you do Civil War history because you're like, oh my gosh, one, I'm never gonna get a job, and two, everything's already been done. And then when you get immersed in the sources, what you realize is there are so many projects out there that are incredibly fascinating. You just have to start thinking about things in a different way.
Yeah.
And The sources are out there that have been entirely underutilized or even unused by scholars.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place for us to stop talking and for you to start talking. So if you have questions, please come to a microphone and ask one.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. And I guess my question is specifically for Professor Broomall. When I was in grad school, I read a book, Shook Over Hell. And so basically it's about institutionalized veterans in Indiana, I think. But you mentioned that soldiers returning, they would sometimes warn their families, I feel like I'm coming undone, you might not recognize me, I've changed. And I'm wondering, even if soldiers could perceive that themselves or not, how did their families and loved ones react kind of in this Victorian world of masculinity when they were seeing these, not just physical, but mental and psychological changes?
Sure. And thank you for the question. So for those who didn't hear the reference, it's Eric Dean Jr.'s book, Shook Over Hell. I think it's 1988, 1989. It was the first book to look seriously at this idea of the traumatized veteran. He chooses a more modern psychological diagnosis for the veterans, and he actually compares Civil War veterans to Vietnam veterans. It's a fascinating book, and in turn, as our first speaker mentioned earlier this morning, there's been a lot of work that's been done on the so-called sort of traumatized veteran. The first thing I would say is, I would warn audiences not to necessarily use the paradigm of PTSD. What they understood it to be was soldier's heart or sad heart. It was a physical ailment that had a manifestation in the psyche to some extent, but they well thought that after 6 months of institutionalization, they would be healed. And so many 19th century families are entirely ill-equipped and unprepared to deal with veterans who have been traumatized by their wartime experiences. There's also an interesting way to juxtapose the experiences of Northern vets versus Confederates in that many Northern vets are perceived, and James Martin does this really well in his book, Sing Not War, as social pariahs. They're on the streets, they're unemployed, they're drawing pensions eventually, they're stigmatized by society around them, whereas many white Southerners uplift Confederate veterans, and that in turn creates a lot of difficulties, I think, for the veterans themselves. There's a certain ideal, to your point, an idealized masculinity that they think they can't live up to because they are so traumatized by their wartime experiences. The other thing I would say finally, though, because I don't want to dominate this, is nuance our understanding, though, too. There are many men who saw many terrible things on the battlefield, yet they themselves are able to process it through the lens of sacrifice or through suffering, and they went on and had very successful political careers, personal lives. And one of the individuals I look at in some detail, William Clarke, he has a seemingly successful marriage, at least in the public arena. He has children, he gets into politics, he's a newspaperman, but he also is an extreme alcoholic, probably rooted in the pain that he journals about from his wartime wounds. There's two faces to that individual. The onus is on us to capture both of those private and personal faces, and that's often hard.
And it's hard because of the nature of the archives, right? I mean, I think you just highlighted a book that needs to be written about the relationship between, men's wartime experiences and how their families cope in the aftermath of war. But it's a really hard book to write because, that's not seen as a topic that, unless we get, I don't know what, how would you find women's, the experiences of women in treating those men? I guess pension records, but, they're often very bare.
Brian, would you mind going back to the Charles Wellington Reed slide? And I'm sorry, I only have to comment about this because that's one of my collections at the Library of Congress, so. Okay, and actually this picks up on Jim's point of looking at the visual aspect of it, because the author of that letter, Charles Wellington Reed, was a Civil War artist and soldier, and some of you may know him as the illustrator of Hardtack and Coffee. And it's a fabulous collection because he would illustrate his letters home when his war was going easy. Not as much when things got a little bit harder, but he's got sketchbooks and he's got Hardtack and Coffee. But if you look at Charles Wellington Reed, and the thing to know is he was here at Gettysburg. He was in Bigelow's brigade. He saw horrible things. And if you look at Charles Wellington Reed, all you see is he had a very charming war. because the goriest his letters ever get, or some of his sketches, is somebody kind of flying through the air because a bomb has burst.
Yeah.
And so if you were just looking at Charles Wellington Reed, you'd think, they're charming like this. They're full of wonderful details, but that's not the war he saw. And he's got different audiences too, because with these, and I should say that this collection's available online through the Library of Congress, so you can read all of these yourself and look at the illustrations, and I encourage you to do so. But he's writing to his mother and his sister in the letters that we have at the library, so obviously that's going to be a one audience. But Hardtack and Coffee is largely for Army of the Potomac. And again, it's still a very charming war. So, I'm just reinforcing all of your points of thinking about the audience, who it is, and, kind of what the aim is, and maybe about the individual themselves and what they feel that they can portray, whether it's visually or in terms of text as well.
Just to reinforce what you're saying, Michelle, didn't Reed win the Medal of Honor for his what he did here? Does anybody know?
Yeah, actually he did.
Yeah,
because
and so I just to reinforce your point, his caption to this image is, "Mom, we
live upstairs now.
You see, we live upstairs now." He's like in a
Yeah.
hammock. In his,
well,
in
and
his
that's one thing that if you're also, as an aside, if you're doing environmental history of the war, this is a fantastic collection to look at.
Sure.
Or you're dealing with kids who can't read text. Because all you have to do is look at the illustrations. It's summer. You look at another one, it's winter because it's winter quarters, or you get a very environmental history too. So he's fabulous on many, many ways.
Yeah.
But again, you have to realize his perspective when he's doing the images and what he's portraying of a war that wasn't entirely what he saw.
Right. Thank you. Howard.
My question is to the whole group. At this point, 160 years later, how often does it still occur that families are finding new caches of letters and bringing them to the public domain?
I think it's still happening quite often. And sometimes not bringing them to the public domain. I mean, one of the things that was so stunning to me when our book came out and I started getting reactions from people is that they pull out their iPhone and show me a tintype of an underage soldier who was their great-great-great-grandpa. And I was like, well, where is this? And they're like, oh, we have it at home. So that was not a one-off. So I think there's many documents, especially, of course, on the East Coast and in the South, where people just still have stuff in their attics.
I think too, the generation that was collecting in the 1960s during the centennial, that generation is starting to sell off those collections because their children are disinterested. There's a flood of material, both material culture and archival materials that has been coming onto the market, which is good and bad, because in many cases you want it to go into public collections, but it's going back up for auction.
Yeah.
So beyond being able to do research in your pajamas, can you speak a little bit about how the mass digitization of records, as well as a lot of these online forums like Jim talked about, private voices, spared and shared, some of these other sources, how that's helping the real war get out there to us?
Oh, absolutely. It's changed everything. I mean, there's been a massive archival turn over the past 20 years. And, people being much more, historians, being much more careful about how we read the archive, but just the access to the archive. When I think about how I do things now, like every single primary source I touch, I look it up on Google Scholar to see who else has used it. Every single time I get a source, like if I'm reading a 19th century text and it has footnotes, I think, oh, what is this person reading? And then I go and look at all the things that they read. I can just, you can follow things in a way now when you couldn't. And, the ancestry revolution, the revolution of people who've been doing their family histories in the, post sort of 60s, all that family history is online. We could not have done the study that we just did without this digital revolution. But in a way, it's presenting certain kinds of difficulties. Like when I look at how my students do history now, they'll keyword search. And I think, you get something very different if you're reading a newspaper and you're flicking through and you're seeing the whole context and everything than you do if you just keyword search because you're looking for something in particular. It's like you've already, when I think about how I came up with my first book, I was just sitting there at the microfilm reading local newspapers and I thought, wow, there's something here to explain of their tone of voice and their sort of concerns and everything. I wouldn't have come up with that project now because I wouldn't sit and look at a microfilm. So I think it has costs and benefits. It's allowed us to follow things in different ways, but it's downsides.
I think the other thing I would add is, and this isn't a critique, but remember, the archives themselves are very specific spaces, and the collections that were preserved at places like the Southern Historical Collection in the 1920s to the 1950s were very specific in scope. And so in many ways, there's just been a lot more source materials about a lot of different types of people that aren't found actually in some of the premier Southern collections that I spent my graduate career looking at. And that's been a very important facet of this. So we have to go into the archive with a degree of skepticism. Why were the sources there preserved in the first place and what wasn't being saved? Mm-hmm. And the Southern's a prime example of that. Again, it's one of my favorite archives, but.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your input for this very fascinating discussion. All throughout the panel discussion, it made me think of Conrad's classic novel, The Heart of Darkness, where basically the imperialist nations didn't want to know the truth of the barbarity of colonial practices. But I just wanted to hear your input on, do you think maybe with some of the pieces that we examined in this discussion maybe reflect that perhaps that same sentiment that maybe perhaps people in general did not want to know the truth of what soldiers maybe and others who went through war had experienced?
Well, I completely agree in the sense that, just look at the reaction to Matthew Brady's, exhibit in New York when people saw that unvarnished version of the war. There was a lot of recoiling. And I do think that there was a sense that seeing mangled bodies without the, artistic conventions to soften that people found it disrespectful to the individuals themselves. They found it ungodly. Yes, I think that there were plenty of people who did not want the unvarnished version of the war, and plenty of people who knew very well what the war looked like on the ground who did not think that the public should be confronted with that.
And then there's a sort of, to the side of that, there's certain kinds of suffering that were just invisible to people because they didn't care. So for instance, it's only in the last decade that we've had books about contraband camps. One of the biggest moments in world history, the emancipation of 4 million people, many of them, they come out of enslavement for the first time. What happens to them? They end up in these camps. Many of them died. We didn't know that, until Jim Downs published his book. And, he was really thinking about why did we not know this until now? Why did we not know that there was this massive smallpox epidemic? And he said it's because the way we've read sources. The sources are there to tell the government how many able-bodied were on the ground to work. They weren't there to tell the government how many people were dying and what the suffering was like, right? So we've had to reconstruct that by reading the sources in different ways. But I think just the fact that some people's suffering didn't matter to people, they didn't see it, they didn't care about it, they didn't write about it. That's a problem that we now have to, rethink in new ways of how to innovatively read sources.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment based on that previous question from the gentleman about finding new sources. Literally yesterday, one was just found. My wife called me last night and said her best friend was going through her 92-year-old father's stuff in Florida, and the family's from Pennsylvania, and she came across a 10-page letter from her great-great-grandfather talking about his service in 138th Pennsylvania and his brother who was killed here at Gettysburg.
Wow.
So it was literally yesterday. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank your panelists.